Stella by Starlight, Chapter 8. Go where I send thee. Well, we have wasted quite enough time with frogs and foolishness, Mrs. Grayson said, buttoning up her smiles. So let's get started. Most of you probably have heard this song, but we need to make sure we have the words and rhythms right. This is for a performance. She raised an eyebrow at Claudia. I trust no other animal shall land in my lap while we proceed. Then she sat down at the old piano, and her fingers seemed to glide over the keys. Stella grinned as she recognized the tune. She had learned it when she was only 2 or 3, sitting on her granny's lap at church. She suddenly remembered sliding the thin band of silver, her grandmother's wedding ring, up and down her granny's thin fingers. Now Mrs. Grayson, pulling the children into the heart of the song, began to sing. Verse, verse, she called out. Children, go where I send thee. How shall I send thee? I'm going to send thee one by one. One was the little bitty baby, born in Bethlehem. I know this one, Jojo cried. It gets longer and longer, and faster, Henrietta added. You should be singing, not talking, Mrs. Grayson told them, keeping to the song's melody as she did so. Verse 2, Mrs. Grayson called out. As you can see, we are doing our arithmetic lessons while we sing. Children, go where I send thee. How shall I send thee? I'm going to send thee 2 by 2. 2 was Paul and Silas. 1 was a little bitty baby, born in Bethlehem. The teacher kept adding more verses until they had completed all 12. Children, go where I send thee. How shall I send thee? I'm going to send thee 12 by 12. 12 was the 12 that couldn't get help. 11 was the 11 that all went to heaven. 10 was the Joseph brothers. 9 was the 9 all dressed so fine. 8 was the 8 who stood at the gate. 7 was the 7 couldn't get to heaven. 6 was the 6 that never got picked. 5 was the 5 that came back alive. 4 was the 4 that stood at the door. 3 was the 3 old wise men. 2 was Paul and Silas. 1 was a little bitty baby, born in Bethlehem. Wonderful, Mrs. Grayson said. Let's do it again, but faster this time. And so they did. Over and over, faster and faster, until they were all breathless with laughter and song. Then Mrs. Grayson abruptly stopped playing. I know it's not in the song, but how much is 3 times 3? She demanded. 9, John Steve responded quickly. She nodded with approval and then looked at the students in the lower grades. How much is 3 plus 3? 6, Jojo chirped. She sure did figure out a way to do it, Carolyn whispered to Stella. To the older children, she said, 4 times 4, 16. 12 times 12, 144. Too easy, Tony said. Excellent, the teacher looked pleased. Now, children, she continued cheerfully, let's begin our writing projects. I will collect them at the end of the day. Stella slumped in her seat, writing, the perfect way to ruin a perfect morning. Mrs. Grayson divided everyone into groups by grades. She tasked the older students with looking up each reference from the song in the Bible and figuring out who were the 8 who stood at the gate, then writing about one of them. The little ones were told to write short word stories or poems about Christmas. When Mrs. Grayson got to Stella's group of 9 to 12-year-olds, she told them, I want each of you to write an essay, an opinion piece. It should be 1 to 2 pages in length, your best penmanship. 2 pages? Stella's stomach curled into knots. Mrs. Grayson caught Stella's eye. Just write down what you think about what happened last night, she suggested. Bumblebee belongs to all of us, and what happens here is important. Outside the classroom window stood an ancient apple tree, its branches gnarled and entwined. They'd all feasted on the fruit since the start of school, but the last of the apples had fallen in the past week. Stella gazed out at the few remaining leaves, stirring in the sharp breeze. When she opened her notebook, her thoughts snarled like those tangled branches. Stella didn't like to write. When she was in 1st grade, she had been the worst reader in the whole class. It had taken her longer than anyone else to figure out the connection between words in her head and the charts of both printed and cursive versions of the ABCs on the wall. Reading and writing had come slowly to Stella in spite of her mother's wallpaper. Mrs. Grayson, so patient, had let Stella work at her own pace, but still she'd struggle with putting it all together. Even now, for sure, she'd never be the class spelling bee champion like Carolyn. So instead of beginning her essay, Stella busied herself with getting ready to get ready. She had a system, pencils on the left, notebook on the right, books in the middle. She liked everything neat and lined up so the edges matched. Not that any of that mattered, she thought glumly. A neat desk couldn't disguise the inside of her notebook, which was a jumble of half-finished work, scratch-outs and mess-ups. Arithmetic wasn't so bad. Numbers lined up in an order that made sense to her, but writing, oh lordy. It wasn't that she didn't have strong opinions on lots of things. She sure did. But putting them on paper just wasn't her piece of cake, or pie, or pancakes with molasses, which she dearly loved. Writing was more like trying to chew an unripe apple, bitter and hard and not worth the effort. Worse, she even had a couple of bad grades in that notebook that she'd hidden from her parents, which she knew was dumb. Eventually her mom and Mrs. Grayson would get to talking at church and her life would be over. And it wasn't that her mind wasn't spinning with ideas. Images of flames, of those stomping horses, were sharp in her memory. It was getting them straight in her notebook. Mrs. Grayson gave her a questioning look, clearly noting Stella had yet to put one word on paper. So Stella finally picked up a pencil. She scratched out words, started again, erased half of it with her almost nub-like gum eraser, started again, stopped. Shoulders slumped, she stared back out the window. A breeze blew a few curled and ruddy leaves from the apple tree. Stella figured sticking those leaves back on the branches would be easier than trying to move the stuff in her head to the empty blue lines in her notebook. Chapter 9, Wise Men. I have not, scratched out, no idea where Bethlehem, scratched out, Bethlehem is. I guess the wise men must have been pretty wise to find it. When the baby Jesus was born, there was a bright, scratch out, bright light in the sky. It was a good star. The preacher, marked out, preacher says, the kings and the wise men followed, marked out, fouled, marked out, chased it. Last night me and JoJo saw a fire that lit up the sky. It was a not good, very bad sign. Scary. No angels, marked out, angels showed up in the sky, and nobody sang any pretty carols. The only wise men I saw were in my mama's kitchen. Stella could think of nothing more to say. She frowned. She started to raise her hand to ask for help, but Mrs. Grayson was busy with the third graders, who seemed to be having no trouble at all with their writing projects. Dunce. She ripped the page out of her notebook, balled it up, and put her head down on her desk. When Mrs. Grayson stopped by to check on Stella with a gentle hand on her shoulder, Stella mumbled something about a stomach ache, and the teacher left her alone for the rest of the afternoon. Stella never finished her assignment.